Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Philosophy Society's podcast, Inquiry. This is the 6th episode, and we have with us Dr.
Stephen Carmody.
Who is an anthropology professor here at Troy University, and he focuses on food deserts. Is that your line of research?
Food studies.
Food studies.
Say food
okay,
studies.
Cool. Yeah, that's broader. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
we'll go
food.
broad.
Yeah,
we'll go broad.
yeah, food studies. So, Professor, I hope you're comfortable with us, the arrangement, etc. Right. Quick question. Why did you get into anthropology?
Like most students, I had no idea what anthropology was when I went back to college, and was kind of forced into an introduction to anthropology class. But I really had no idea what anthropology was. And so anthropology has different subdisciplines. So under the umbrella of anthropology, you have biological anthropology or physical anthropology, which kind of gets into like human evolution, but then also forensics. So it's a pretty wide spectrum of studies. You have linguistics. You have cultural anthropology, which studies, modern societies, and you have archaeology, studies, prehistoric societies or historical era societies. So I got into the introduction to anthropology class and was frankly surprised that someone could get paid to dig in the dirt and spend their life outside, playing in the dirt. And so I decided I was going to pursue it as a major. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do cultural or if I wanted to do archaeology. So I took upper level courses in each of those different subdisciplines. And then at the end of the day, decided that I was more interested in doing archaeology. And so I kind of followed that route through undergraduate and then went to graduate school. All three of my degrees are in anthropology. But my specialty, people always get kind of confused about how, I'm an anthropological archaeologist is what I would say.
Oh, okay, so a bit of culture as
yeah,
well.
so there's kind of this misconception that, well, it's not a misconception, it's a history, that archaeologists want to dig up artifacts and put them in museums, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of as a discipline, we'd say we've left that behind, right? That I am interested in excavating archaeological sites and telling a story from those artifacts, right? So I know it sounds cliche, but we always say kind of give a voice to the voiceless, right? There are a lot of people that lived here. I focus on Eastern North America.
Oh, okay.
People have been here for somewhere between 15 and 8,000 years. We've had written documents in this part of the world since Europeans got here. So there's a large part of prehistory where there are no written documents. And so we try to talk about culture and how people lived, men, women, and children, the elderly, what relationships look like based on the artifacts that we recover from those sites. So that's kind of where the anthropological comes into the archaeology, right?
Do you actually go on digs? Have you been on digs before?
Sure. Yeah, no, I have.
With a spade?
We don't use spades.
Oh,
right?
Okay. You don't want to break
another
the
misconception. Mummies. No, we dig in 5 or 10 centimeter increments, very slowly.
Okay.
So I think most people who come on a dig, you think it's kind of like the old cowboy days, right? Dynamite, pickaxes, and shovels, mummies and rattlesnakes. No, it's very meticulous. We probably spend more time writing and documenting, drawing, photographing than most people think. But that's a large part of it. So archaeology in and of itself is destructive. Once you take it out of the ground, you can't put it back. If you do it the wrong way, you lose the story. So the artifact tells you something, but the context of the artifact, so where it falls out in space, tells you more. And so it's this idea that we're really trying to tell a more complete story of the past through those excavations. So I've worked on, I went back to school and started my undergraduate degree when I was 30. So about 12 years ago. And I went on a dig I'm 43. You're trying to do the math in your head. I went back much later in life. I had another career. It pretty much started volunteering on excavations in Charleston, South Carolina. And then I went and did my archaeology field school in Italy.
Oh, okay.
And then I had an interest in working abroad. It's much more practical to do it here, to be able to walk out of your door and work. And so when I started graduate school, I started to focus more on this part of the country, so this part of the world. So yeah, but we do digs almost every summer. I run or co-direct a field school almost every summer. And that's where we collect a lot of our data, for our own personal research through those field schools.
Right. Have you found anything that surprised you that is, I don't know, unintuitive? You'd think that, well, I mean, the common cliche is that, ancient people were Neanderthals and did nothing with themselves. I think all of us know that that's not the case now. But
Right.
have you found any, I don't know, unintuitive stories, let's say,
No, I think,
around this part of the world that didn't necessarily fit the general narrative that we've had?
no, I would say, so a couple things, yes and no. So we know so little about what life was like here in the past. We have great excavations, and there's a long history of excavations here, but the story changes all the time. We still don't know when people got here.
Oh, okay.
We still argue about where people came from, whether they came from Europe or whether they came from Northeast Asia. All of the genetic DNA evidence today supports the idea people came from Northeast Asia, but there's other reasons to think people might have come from Europe. Why couldn't people have come from two directions? Why do we need one? Could people have come up from South America and Mexico? These are big questions that we still kind of grapple with as archaeologists, as North American archaeologists. So there's a lot that we find that either kind of confirms the story that's been out there, but there are things that we find that change the story from time to time. And so for me, and this is where people normally glaze over, I study plants. I study plant use.
Oh, okay.
So, some people will study projectile points or arrowheads. Some people study ceramics or animal bones. I study plants, right?
How do you study that? The plants
So
readily decay.
not if they're carbonized.
Oh, okay.
So if they're introduced to fire, they'll
Yeah.
preserve.
Uh-huh.
And so when I got interested in archaeology and trying to figure out what it was I wanted to study,
That seems like a very specific
It is.
niche
It
use
is.
case, though.
there are a handful of us, right?
Yeah.
Maybe because people think it's so boring. But so, and the real story, I always tell people how I got into plant studies. And this is again, when I was a senior, I was taking an underwater archaeology class at the College of Charleston. And the day they handed out our research assignments, I missed or skipped. I wasn't there. And when I came back, there was only one topic left on the sign-up sheet, and it was paleoethnobotany. And that is the study of people and plants in the past. And so I didn't know much about it, and started doing my research paper and was like, this is amazing. And so when I decided to go to graduate school and needing to learn how to identify plant remains under the microscope, I had to find somebody who could train me. And there are really only 2 or 3 places in eastern North America that have a paleoethnobotanist on staff. And University of Tennessee was one. They actually had 2. And so
okay.
I ended up going there. So that's kind of how I got into this area of research. And, people always say, food, we know what people ate. And that's true to some extent, right? Like we do know what people ate. For me, more specifically, I got interested in the origins of agriculture, right? So all history students know, or most history students at some level have seen that picture of, the origins of agriculture, between the Fertile Crescent of the Tigris and the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. And this idea that agriculture was invented and kind of diffused around the world. And that's not true. That's not true at all, right? So agriculture was independently developed in 8 or 9 places around the world. And it might be 15 in another 20 years when other areas open up where people can't go today. But we know that Eastern North America was one of those places where native people domesticated indigenous plants. And so one thing else you hear in a history class or an introduction to anthropology class is that one of the first things, you have origins of agriculture, and then you have state-level civilizations that are built off of that agriculture, right? So we know that. In North America, that never happens. And so trying to understand the connection between agriculture and state-level societies, and then really what follows state-level societies, which is warfare and inequality. To me, that really became kind of intriguing, that you have this one area here, Eastern North America, where you don't have the same type of development you see in other places around the world, like the Egyptians or Mesoamerica. And so why not? What is it about what happens here that's different? And so, we know the plants that were domesticated here. Most of them are plants people have never heard of. Amaranth is a big one people know now because you can buy amaranth flower at Whole Foods and places like that. The other ones are just weeds that whenever I talk about farmers, say, I can't get rid of that. I spend all this money to eradicate these weeds. And so that's getting a little too far ahead of myself. So I was interested in that process of domestication here. And so my dissertation research focused on looking for evidence of that domestication in uplands. So all the theories in North America right now suggest these plants were domesticated in the floodplains. And it makes a lot of sense because they grow there. They also grow in the uplands. So there's always been this question of, could it happen in the uplands as well? And I spent, a couple years excavating upland rock shelters looking for these plants and finding them and showing really for the first time that process of domestication in the uplands. So to your question about have you ever found anything that was a little bit different than Tellus, that did. Somewhere in all that story, I got really interested in just food in general, right? So, and food is such a powerful, it's such a powerful thing, right? It's such
concept.
It is, right? But just even from a conceptual to your plate. And so I got really interested in, food production today, food production in the past, food production in the future. So it's kind of taken.
That was sorry to sort of cut you off. I'm not trying to.
Yeah,
cut
no,
you off, just building on that. I was actually had this question, but you prefaced it pretty well, and so I thought I should go for it right before you head somewhere else, and then I'll forget the question I had.
Sure.
But essentially, has your studies of anthropology affected how you view food on a personal level?
Oh my gosh. I always tell people I can't go eat food. I can't have dinner with anybody without thinking about food, right? And from a research standpoint.
Yeah.
So I teach a class on food and social justice. So it's really kind of like I say, taking me this story about food production in the past is really taking me kind of on this neat journey that I'm still on. All these plants that were grown in the past for food, I'm regrowing today. We're trying to cook with them. We're trying to find ways. So a lot of different research aspects to this project. But no, how it affects me today. I've got 3 kids. And so, we talk today, people talk today about problems that we have with our food system, whether it's related to environmental justice and to healthcare. Food is tied to so many of these big issues that we have as a society today. So that really got me interested in this whole idea of food. And, to your question about, how it affects me today, I tell students when we talk, when this subject comes up, seeing what people put on their plate. When you build your plate, you build your identity. You can't separate food and culture. You just can't, right? So if we all had different options, if the 4 of us all walked into a restaurant together or a cafeteria, we put different things on our plate. And each component you put on your plate is a part of your identity for one reason or another. And that's really interesting to me. Food has the ability to unite us. It has the ability to divide us. And you can see differences either in your ancestry, your person, your family. From a biological aspect, we have to have food, right? Because if you don't survive. But we also make choices, and those choices are really interesting to me. I assume people made choices in the past, and so it is, to me, it's more than just kind of, a lot of people just kind of make decisions about food from breakfast, lunch to dinner. Sometimes it's hard for me to separate that, and I always tell students, if I could follow you around and watch you eat every meal, or when I tell students, if I came to the frat house and went through your trash can, I learn an awful lot about you, more than you would think, and you wouldn't want me to do that But I could talk about what a feast looks like today, the same way I do that in the past at archaeological sites, right? What is a feast today? What is a feast in the past? How people treat food, how people think about food, right? How food shapes your life. I tell students one of the last things I do at night before I go to bed is load the coffee pot, and the first thing I do in the morning is hit the start button, right? It dictates our days, really. So it is. It's like this powerful thing that that really dictates who we are to other people. It's a signal to other people who we are. So for me, that's really fascinating. To me, it's really interesting to think about those choices people make. And then the other end of that spectrum is kind of how we produce food today, where we are with that, and how we're going to do that in the future.
It's clear that you were fascinated by the mechanisms of food in general, both the idea and the output. And, listening to you, that's fascinating in and of itself. But the problem I see with people who are into, not the problem with the people, but the problem that people experience when they're trying to get at the mechanistic root of anything, right? How it all pans out. Like I don't know, Hegel. He talks about the dialectic, but when you ask him for his own opinion about what he wants to offer to society, he says, I have none now, right? Because now he's sort of understood his the dialectic or how it works, or so he claims, in his own way. Now he has nothing to contribute. This is only contribution, right? But he takes a step back from society, and he can't influence society in any way, shape, or form. He's at this decision paradox where he cannot make a decision because he somehow knows the underpinnings of how things work. Right? He can't make intuitive or whatever and base level decision based on just instinct. How do you decide on food then? Right? If you view food as your identity, which I sort of do, but I'm not always thinking about it. If you're also
That's
prone
the thing,
to,
it's unconscious,
yes,
right?
yes. If you're prone to think about it and it's become a conscious process for you, then how do you even decide on Scoring identity points, so as to say.
No, I know what you're
Are
saying.
you not hit
It's
with decision paradox?
I was born in Louisiana,
Mhm.
right? So I definitely have these kind of like these draws to Cajun, Creole food, whatever you want to call it. And I want that to be a part of my children's story, even though they'll never live in Louisiana, right? So we do it when I have dinner Christmas Eve with my family, right? Christmas Eve we do gumbo, right? So you tell people that who live other places like you have gumbo for Christmas dinner. Yeah, it's who we are. It's our identity, right? Like that draws us in. It unites us. We have a shared common ancestry, and food is a part of that, no matter who you are. So in terms of the choices, we all eat what's comfortable to us. That's why food's called. We have comfort foods. We have the balance there to me more than those types of choices. We're more about health now. I became much more conscious of what I eat after I started to have children, right? And started to think about, well, they eat what I eat. So if I'm eating garbage, then they're eating garbage and saying, well, Daddy eats garbage, so we're going to eat garbage, right? So there is, the thing with the food, it gets so big so quickly because you can't just talk about food in terms of what you're going to eat because then that gets into the whole system idea. And we have so many problems with the food system today, whether it's the fact that you have, and I'm going to get into like the coach speak, the professor speak without meaning to, but we talk about the problems in the system, that you have 1 billion people that are hungry every night and 1 billion people that are overfed, underfed, 2 billion people that suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. All as a result of the foods that we eat every day. And we make decisions about these foods and we don't think about how they're produced and where they're produced and who doesn't get enough and who does. And it gets big quickly, right? These ideas of what you put on your plate and how that influences everything, how that affects the environment, how the environment affects that. And so, again, the decisions to me now are more about the patterns I'm setting for my children. And again, by trying to establish these patterns, on some level, that kind of dictates their identity to them, right? Because they're going to grow up with these patterns they might not understand. And if I didn't study food, it might be different. They might have different options or choices. But we kind of build our identity as we build our plates. I think that's a very interesting and very powerful idea, especially when we start talking about some of these problems that we have in the larger system. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
But... Yeah, no, it does. It does. Not to build, that was a nice concluding note, so I can't really build off of that. Trying to attack this from a new perspective. Do you think there's this, especially with my mom, she's obsessed with eating like the old people did, right? Because for some reason she is convinced that food now is just categorically worse than food back in the day, or food patterns and food styles back in the day. So she constantly seeks out, like, I don't know, old sorts of food from a few hundred years ago, grains that nobody ever uses anymore. Things like that. I'm from India, so India already has a large food palette. I don't know if you studied Indian food, if at all.
I don't, because I mainly focus in some of the classes I teach, we talk about food and culture.
So, and India has a large vegetarian culture as well, so therefore there's a lot more variety in just use of plants that even I know of. Like, my house is always stocked with random grains all the time, but I don't even know the names to most of them. But my mom goes one step further and seeks out more random grains, grains that nobody knows the name of, things like that. Do you think that there's any merit to it?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about, food today, I mean, what do we eat today? Most people don't know, right?
I don't know, like Taco Bell.
Food has come convenient for us, right? So for most people, food's convenient. And again, this gets into a whole larger topic about the 50s and 60s and post-World War II and how microwaves and how food was sold as convenience and Lunchables and things that are terrible for us that we eat because it's convenient, right? No, there is. I mean, I think most people, we've lost that connection, right? Like, we've lost that connection to our food source. And that's scary in some ways. But it's part of living in the industrialized world. It's part of living in the world that we live in today. I talk about plant domestication years ago. We say that people relied on something like 7,000 or 8,000 wild plant food resources in the past. Through the domestication process, we've reduced
maybe 100. I don't know. A few hundred.
3 plants. 3 plants today provide 66% of the global calories. That's on one point, that's fascinating that we've been able to do that. That's kind of scary on the other end of that spectrum, right? Because you said you make yourself susceptible to disease and things like that, right? So we say today that 30 plants, 30 plants and about 5 or 6 animals feed the world. So we've greatly just reduced biodiversity of plants and animals just through the domestication process. Now, did people 15,000 years ago know that was going to be the intended that was the intended consequence of those decisions? Well, I would say no. We've just been really good at doing it.
Right.
And so, we've reduced our food supply while we increase the amount of land that we need to produce. So you do kind of get to this point. And again, this always kind of goes from like the small, what's on your plate, to the big problems of, how are we going to produce food in 100 years? Where are we going to produce food in 100 years? Yeah, so the unintended consequences, I don't think, people didn't understand that was what was going to happen. But we've reduced our food supply greatly. And so I'm interested in those ancient crops. As I said a minute ago, I have a research garden at the University of the South where I taught before I came here, where we're growing these plants for greens and for grains. And most of these plants people have never eaten. And so we're playing around with that. Again, it's just the idea today that we know so little about our food, the chemicals that are in our food. If you've there's some great movies out there and some great books about, the amount of money that the food industry spends on research, basically, to try to figure out how much sugar they can pump into us before it makes us sick, how much salt they can pump into us before, when we have these health epidemics, right, that we know about. And so much of it's related to our food. But, there's sometimes not always that connection there between, if I eat this, then these are the outcomes of that. So, no, I think...
Is that because salt and sugar are cheap calories?
Well, I don't know that it's as much that they're cheap calories, but right, if you can, you put
Is
salt
it just
in
for taste?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at kind of like what happened in the 90s, and this is a little bit out of my expertise of growing ancient crops, right? But with the whole like fast food, like reduced fat and fat free, you take the calories out, you got to fill it with sugar or salt to get people to eat it. So then, you're getting fewer calories, but you're getting more sugar. And I know you guys have heard this before, but go to the grocery store and any label you pick up, flip it over and see what percentage of sugar is in that food product. It's the only thing on the label there's not a percentage next to. Why is that?
Because it's such a large.
Because the sugar law, because they don't want you to know. Most people don't know how much they're supposed to have a day. So if I told you you're supposed to have 2 teaspoons a day, but most Americans eat somewhere between 26 and 28 teaspoons a day, that's a lot of sugar, right? And we know the ill effects of eating too much sugar. Same thing with salt. So, so the idea that food has just become manufactured and it's not maybe real anymore, you hear that all the time, these new food movements, these real food movements.
This is exactly where I was kind of going to go with my question.
Yeah.
Oh, well, go. Then jump in. This is like, I always tell people, it's like jump rope, double dutch. You feel good, jump in, right? And but don't touch that.
Speaking of artificial foods, have you heard of things like Soylent, for instance, where it's literally just a powder that it's a big thing like over in Silicon Valley. It's just a powder people mix with water and then drink it, like as part of like and that's supposed to be, for some people, they're trying to use it like a dietary replacement. But more and more we kind of see that people are just manufacturing something and then shipping it out in a box or in a bag or whatever, and it really is a matter of convenience.
Right, but that's been the story really of over the past 50, 60 years of our food.
Do you think it's going to continue going that way?
Yeah, well, I don't see any dramatic changes. You see all these, local movements, kind of, farm to table, farmers markets, stuff like that. But that's really a niche market too, right? I mean, there are all kind of great stories out there about, who those alternative food systems really serve, right? I think most people would tell you that alternative food is an upper end of the socioeconomic. Who can afford that, right? So you get these questions about the alternative food movement being largely affluent white people, right? So we can say that, I guess. So I don't know that again, this goes back to the idea that most people, I think about how that you have to eat. A lot of people make decisions based on their economic situation. So if it's cheaper to buy. If you have to feed your children, then you buy what's cheap, but just because it's cheap, it might mean it's not as good, right? The quality's not as high. So people are kind of forced into those situations, and that gets into the whole, the injustice in the food system, right? That in food deserts and things like that. So again, the question always starts off like what's on your plate, and then you end up in these like large, kind of political type questions that we talk about today. But no, I think yeah, a lot of people do it out of convenience, right? I mean, a lot of people do. I want I eat breakfast bars because I don't have to cook anything, right? I can put it in my pocket and eat it as I'm driving to school every day. I can't read half the ingredients that are on the label, but I know that it gets me from A to B without having to wash a plate or cook, pull a pot out. So we all make those decisions. Whether that'll change, I don't know what it would take to change that. But I think we're all guilty of it on some level but I think if you kind of look back into the history of that and you see, I think the example that we always talk that I talk about in class a lot, cereal. The history of cereal in America is really an interesting story. Cereal's not really healthy, but it's quick. You pour it out of it. Look at the sugar in cereal. Look at the and not all cereal. It's all different. But again, I fall victim to when my kids want the cereal with the animals and all the colors on so you do. I mean, that's all being marketed to you for a certain reason, right? Companies know that, and so they're going to sell you that product. And even though it's not good, they understand that most parents in the grocery store with their children who are screaming and losing their minds because they want the animal cereal are going to buy the animal cereal, right? And so our food is just marketed to us for certain reasons. And so a lot of people, parents who work, that's the reality that things have to be quick and easy sometimes. And so the market has been, our market, in this part of the world, has been geared to that convenience for years. I think we talk about, most supermarkets have something like 28,000 products, right? They are looking for your business. They are trying to sell you whatever they can. And again, most of those decisions are made about convenience. And so I don't know that it changes anytime soon. I think that a lot of people would tell you it's not a problem. So that it's just, convenience is.
Was there ever a point in time that people didn't look at food in terms of convenience, though? Because people just centered their lives around eating food as some process instead of eating food to do other processes. Because it seems to me that even the invention of cooking, right,
Sure.
is a measure of convenience. And we started cooking, I don't know how many thousands of years ago, but
Well, we teach that in Introduction to Anthropology.
Right.
We think we see controlled use of fire.
I
somewhere.
did take an introduction to anthropology.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you. It was Baumeister, the professor who left.
Yes. Yeah.
But
So then,
I don't
so then you
remember.
probably can tell me when we think we see the controlled use of fire in the archaeological record.
Yeah.
I'll let you off the hook on this one. So we think somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million years ago, our ancestors were able to use fire as a tool to cook, things like that. In terms of people making their food choices, if we say that we've been food producers for about 15,000 years, that means for millions of years we were hunter-gatherers, collectors, scavengers. And so that's one of these great questions about agriculture. What was it that pushed people into agriculture? And so there are tons of theories, and that's one thing I'm really interested in. If hunting and gathering was a terrible way of life, which is that's been historically the explanation, that people were hungry, populations got too high, people had to produce food. So that's testable archaeologically, and that idea hasn't held up. We see population pressure increase after agriculture, not before. But that makes sense because now you have this food supply, right? Women can have children every year and not have to space them out every 3 or 4 years because they're hunter-gatherers, right? And so it makes sense what we see in the archaeological record. So before that, people, were gathering wild resources, and so they had to move seasonally to follow those resources. So, yeah, I think there's always been that underlying, biological, you have to have food to survive. But I certainly think people made choices, and so the same way, I would argue that you can see culture in food today. I would argue you could probably see that in the past, and a lot of people might not say that, but we argue from an archaeological standpoint that we can see cultures based on rocks and projectile points. So why couldn't we see them on the types? Can't we see the same thing in the types of food people chose, right, to eat?
Do you think my primary question though is, do you think the attitude towards food has changed, or the attitude towards food has largely been the same? Attitude in terms of, just viewing food as something you have to do. Like, I the attitude towards excretion has remained consistent throughout time, right? It's
Right.
something you have to do,
Yeah,
and then
right.
nobody sits there, enjoying the process. But do you think that the attitude has somewhat largely remained the same? If it has, then there is an argument to be made that this is some sort of natural evolution toward food that we're having now. But
Sure. Well, I think I think there's so many different levels
Mhm.
to that question, right? Yeah. So certainly people would have had to have eaten, right?
Yeah.
So we get that. But could they have enjoyed it as well?
Mhm.
So you talk about your mom who likes to go collect obscure,
Yeah.
and she enjoys that, right? She likes that. So that might not. She might not want to do that every meal,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes she just might need that convenient cup of coffee and the donut, right,
Yeah.
to get out the door. So, but I think we do, and that's then again, there's kind of this interesting question about how does that food tie people together when you want to slow down and have a feast? What does a feast at your house look like today? It's probably very different than every other meal. So no, I certainly think we think we can see feasting in the archaeological record where people would have come together and had large events, large amounts of people eating maybe special foods. We think we can see that sometimes in the archaeological record. So yeah, sometimes it might be about convenience, but it doesn't mean it has to be every day. And I think we see that today when whether breakfast is convenience and then lunch is at the cafeteria or at the student center with all your friends, right? We tend to organize around food, and that's probably always been. So there is something more to it than just biological, I would argue. And I think most people would. I'm not saying that as a revolutionary idea. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
In a long-winded way, but yes.
Oh,
yes,
well,
yeah.
they're always going.
Yeah, which is great though. That's what
Okay.
we're looking for.
So you mentioned you teach a class about food systems and social justice, yeah?
Mhm.
Implicit in that is, well, that our current food systems and our ways of organizing them are unjust, right? And I can extrapolate what you mean from that. But I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail. Exactly what is unjust and how we could have a juster way of organizing our food.
Well, I mean, I can a little bit, but that, right, everybody kind of has an answer. Everybody has a different take on this, right? Some people would tell you that you have to have, some people tell you in the market system, right, you have to have a certain amount of people who have a lot, a certain amount of people who don't have enough, and that the system just kind of bears out the way it is. And that's just a product of the type of world that we want to live in. And everybody would have to answer that question on their own. I think when you talk about the injustice aspect of the food system, and again, no one has to agree that there is, but kind of the classic understandings in maybe would be injustice from a health food, from access to healthy food, right? So is healthy, adequate, nutritious food a right? Right? We talk about rights a lot today in our society. What's right? What's wrong? And everybody would have a different opinion about that. So in terms of the injustices that I could argue are in the food system, it could come down to access to that type of food, and how that system has been influenced by the modern highway systems and food deserts and suburban, what people refer to what maybe was called white flight to the suburbs and how that affects inner city populations, right? So there are a lot of different, in terms of the structural injustices, there are a lot of things there people would argue. But I think when I talk about it and we talk about it in class, I tend to focus on environmental justice, health, because that is, we talk today, we spend a lot of time today talking about healthcare systems and we have a healthcare crisis, and we talk about that in America all the time. You hear that all the time, right? Why is that? I think you can make direct ties into our food system, right? Which then comes another interesting question when you talk about who controls the food system and who controls the healthcare system, and is there really a desire for
people, I don't know, not well nourished so that they're dependent on healthcare?
Sure. I mean, I think you could have that. I think you could have that conversation.
Uh-huh.
So I think there are a lot of injustices then that we could talk about from the healthcare system. And what we focus, again, this class that I've taught, and I'm teaching in the spring, not a plug for the class. No, but we kind of focus on that over time, right? We look at what agriculture has done, right? So is agriculture this huge leap forward that we've always taught people that it is, right? Agriculture is the making of the modern world. Over the last 15,000 years, we have made the modern world based on agriculture. Looking back, though, was it a great thing, right? Where are we today? Are we better off? There are a lot of people that are hungry, right?
Right. And a lot of anthropologists would say that we were happier or what have you, better fed in the past.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think that idea that, kind of came out of the 60s. The idea was that, indigenous populations here around the world were hungry, right? And they needed to do this. But you look back now and we look at, at modern hunter-gatherer groups that were observed in the 60s and 70s. And then, so you could also argue, are they real relics of the past, or they've been influenced by the modern system? But we know that they were able to collect all of their food for their groups in 2 or 3 days, right? Agriculture is not this easy process.
Yeah.
It's a 365 operation. Hunting and gathering is not. And so the idea that, kind of the idea in anthropology, that hunter and gatherers were the first affluent society, right? But when Europeans were making that decision in the past, civilization to them looked like European civilization. They dictated what civilization was. And civilization was agriculture and art and museums and libraries. And this is all kind of simplistic, but that's kind of the idea.
Also politicians, but
What's that?
Also politicians.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the idea that it was, I mean, we're still talking now about was it this great?
I meant politicians are intrinsic to society.
Sure.
In ancient Greece.
Right.
Like
Exactly. So the definition of what civilization was dictated by Europeans. And so we've historically then seen problems with that notion, right? And we largely reject those ideas today of, social Darwinism is what we kind of teach it as. But yeah, so back to, I know this has kind of gone a long way from your question about injustice, but yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways people try to approach those injustices. And we try to focus on as many as we can, and then talk about what people are doing to try to combat some of those. Whether people really think it's worth it. And again, back to this idea that you have to have the haves and have-nots in a market economy. But we kind of look at the alternative movements and see which ones could work, would work, if any of them, or if it's possible, or if people are just we're kind of a part of this system that's never going to change now.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversations to be had there, I imagine,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Did that I don't know if that...
Oh, of course,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
It's great.
okay.
The talk is one about percentages, though, in terms of maybe magnitude. Sure, we have more hungry people now than ever before because we have more people on the planet now than ever before. But do you think at any point in time in history that the percentages of people who went hungry was appreciably or even significantly lower than what they are now? Do you think there's an argument to be made there? Because unless you can, I don't see how you can make an argument for how we structure food and distribution of food now is just categorically worse than how it was in the past.
Right. Yeah. So percentage-wise, there are people who have done studies, and I can just think in more recent history about the effects of the Green Revolution. So you have as many people today as hungry as there were before the Green Revolution. So a lot of people talking now about whether what was the Green Revolution really about? Was it successful? Was it about stopping the flow of communism into Mexico and Southeast Asia? Was it really about feeding people? What was the Green Revolution about? So today, as many people hungry as then. So percentage-wise then, so if we say that there are 8 billion people on the planet, 9 billion people on the planet today, and you have 1 billion people that go to bed hungry every night.
That's around
a tenth of,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So has it always been that high? I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we certainly don't have those numbers from prehistory. Looking back, we say that the global population reached 1 billion for the first time in 1804, I think is the census data. So if you go back to 1804, where there have been 1 million people hungry on the planet, maybe. So maybe the problem just grows in scale, right? So to me, it's not about. So to me, the way I think about it, then, the question's not as much about does the system produce the same amount of hunger. It's do we produce enough food to feed those people?
Right.
And if we do, why don't they have it? And how do we get it to them? Right.
Right.
So we produce enough food to feed everybody on the planet, but we still have this kind of disparity that exists. So
I mean,
that gets back more to the system aspect of it.
Back then, you could argue that people produced food in what they saw they needed. Of
Sure.
course, they wouldn't know if someone in Africa was starving.
Sure.
Someone in Asia wouldn't know if someone in Africa was starving because, the world wasn't connected at all. And so,
So ignorance is bliss.
yeah, well, yes. And so, they fed their world, so as
Sure.
to say, right?
Right.
But do you think they fed their world entirely, though? Do you think they were far more just with their distribution of food within their world?
Right. When everybody,
Or was that population still at 10%, right? In any kingdom, let's say, or in any group of society, 10% of people would go hungry. If that's the case, then then they could have produced food. They didn't, right? I don't think.
Sure. So with hunter-gatherer groups, we say probably not. We probably say
Right.
that everybody ate, right? There were distribution systems, exchange systems that everybody participated, everybody ate. So then that switch comes when you talk about agriculture,
Right.
right? And then when you have agriculture, then you start to see these inequalities kind of play out in a larger societal scale. So my assumption would be that in the past, when more people were involved in food production, so
More
just-
people got food.
yes,
Okay.
right. So we say that in again, these numbers, the statistics are a little dated in my head because I haven't taught the class since the spring. But in the late 1800s, 54% of Americans were farmers.
Right.
So today, what percentage of Americans farm? It's like 5. So now these farms produce more food because these are agro businesses, right?
Right.
So that takes the production to a different place, the distribution to a different place, right? So where you used to have community-wide access, maybe now those distribution centers have changed, the production areas have changed. So yeah, that's a great question whether the percentages have always been the same, right? It's just the system's gotten bigger and you still have the same number of people. Yeah, I mean, I don't. To me, I don't have an answer to that question. I guess is what I'm saying.
But
In terms of what we are able to produce
right.
in the system,
Right.
we're able to produce enough.
Yeah.
So and again, that's another question of access.
But you said something interesting there, where if people were more involved in the food production themselves, they get to eat, right? They ate. Then doesn't that seem to signal that our senses of fairness, let's say, or our motivations to fairness is still rudimentary in that we get the motivation to feed people or to be fair if we're involved with them in some sense, or we know they're involved with us in this larger game in some sense, and that even though we can sort of intellectually understand that we're all dependent on each other in the economy, since we don't actually see it playing out that way, we're siloed into our small communities, we don't necessarily have the emotional impetus to, I don't know, feed people in Africa, right? Or feed people anywhere else in the world. So doesn't that seem to signal a more, I don't know, a biological or even intelligence-wise constraint on our, there's a distance between our emotional motivations
Sure.
and what we can
Well,
perceive, and that doesn't translate into.
Well, no, I would agree with that. And so again, back to this idea about hunter-gatherers taking care of everybody, right? And starting out in smaller groups, they were basically, we think they were kin-based groups. So you had more of an interest in taking care of each other, right? Because they were your family.
Yeah.
So you did. You felt more of a pull or a push to make sure everybody was fed, and No, I mean, I think I can answer that question. I could flip it to you guys and say, I mean, do you think that most people think or care about these issues? Or if they're just kind of issues that we talk about large scale, and then we don't really, then we kind of go back, like you said, to our own little, my problems. I go home at night, close my door, my set of problems change, right? I'm not a food producer. I try, not on a different scale. But no, I don't know. I don't know if you had more people producing food, if you'd have less hungry people. I don't know if that's the, again, we produce more food. We waste more food than sometimes we use. So again, the production, like I say, our system of producing food is incredible. I mean, it's gotten, we're able to produce food for everybody on the planet, and that in and of itself is somewhat fascinating if you think about that. So maybe the question then is how do you get it to people who don't have it, right? And in the past, there were certainly people that didn't have food. I mean, right? We can see from an archaeological standpoint that people sometimes did better or did worse before or after agriculture. There have always been people who haven't had access to it, right? We talk about going from, bands to chiefdoms, the idea of having inherited status. That certainly, if you were the chief, your family had access to resources other people didn't. So you've always had that. And when I said a minute ago, one of the first things we always see follow food production is inequality. So, we say inequality, and that immediately becomes a negative thing. But you see that stratification. And so you see people who, producers, consumers, people on top, people on the bottom. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but we always see that as a result of food production. So before food production, we say there's not a lot of that. So it's part of the system, right? It's part of the system. Yeah, so just to, and I know we'll wrap up here in a second, but kind of back to what you were saying, with all the different issues that we have, in terms of society, these aren't ones we talk about all the time. There are other things that are bigger. So I think it more becomes an issue that there's so many different issues that we have that we're trying to solve and fix, and that this one sometimes falls out. I don't think most people think about the injustices that are part of our food system all the time, unless we see it or hear about it or read about it, And again, back to this question of injustices or inequalities in the food system, it's different from place to place. And so this is not a universal problem. We talked a minute ago, if you live in the developed world, you're more likely to know someone to die from eating too much. If you live in the underdeveloped world, you're more likely to know somebody who dies from not enough. And that, again,
I know a lot of people who are on course to dying because of eating too much, if that counts.
What's that?
I know a lot of people who are on course to dying because of eating too much.
Because of their diet, right?
Yes.
So you have part of the world where you're dying from eating too much. Another part, people die from not having enough. And so that's right. That's interesting.
It's kind of like evolution has primed us towards something that's,
Well, to have told people 15,000 years ago, let's just use that as our kickoff date for agriculture. That was the earliest. To tell people about domesticating plants, that in 15,000 years, there are going to be people dying because they ate too much. Like, that probably would have blown their mind, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a good idea if we have people who, heart disease in America, I think, is now the leading cause.
Diabetes.
I'm going to get out of my wheelhouse here for a minute, but let's stay on diabetes too.
Yeah.
Diabetes and heart disease are directly related to diet.
Yeah.
So it is about the food that you eat.
Yeah.
So the fact that, the two main killers, if it is heart disease and diabetes, are diet related, So,
I mean, even cancer, we've sort of filtered out carcinogenic substances that we ingest all the time.
Yeah.
The stuff we use, Teflon, things like that. But
and I do think heart disease now is the number one. And so, again, directly related to diet. And so I don't think people would have said in the past, like, if we give you this crystal ball, right, and shake it up, and 15,000 years, people are going to be dying because they eat too much, or the choices they make are just not the right choices.
Or even the levels of obesity they wouldn't have seen or perceived. They wouldn't perceive of man as being that wide.
Right.
Ever.
Right. And I know a couple of years ago, a student brought me an article, and I say it all the time, I'm in my wheelhouse. I get off into these kind of areas where I'm not an expert. It said that the new trend in nutrition is this idea in the developed world of overfed but undernourished. And it's people, how can you be suffering from micronutrient deficiencies if you're overfed? And again, it goes back to the food we eat, because all of the nutrients are taken out. Again, go back to this idea of these 20 plants, 30 plants. We've stripped all the nutrients out of them. We've taken all the nutrients out of them. So we're producing calories, but are we producing nutrients? And again, that's a whole other, would people rather have broccoli or corn? I mean, that's the, I want to oversimplify that too. But again, is it nutrients or calories we're trying to produce? And so.
We're sort of running short on time, so one quick final question. Actually, not quick, but this is the final question I ask for everybody here. It's sort of our, routine. Essentially, is there one idea that you think has influenced you or your academics the most?
One idea?
Just one idea or one instance or whatever you went into. something that, just one statement or one happening that defined you?
Man, that's hard. I don't know. I'd probably have to go back to something about agriculture,
Uh-huh.
something about food that that kind of took me down a different
But
rabbit
maybe
hole.
maybe even food. Was there one whatever unique way of viewing the concept of food that spurned your desire to go study food?
No, but again, it's back. I don't know that it was ever something I ever thought about until I kind of got down that path, and then it was like agriculture, and then it was like, oh, okay, let's think about that, and it's like all this stuff about agriculture, and then it really did kind of over the past couple of years, just lead me down this path. And I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine who's a professor at Bryn Mawr. We were out in the field working on a site in excavation, and we were outside by ourselves all day, and he just said, "Start talking. We got all day. Tell me about what you do." And I started talking about agriculture. And at the end of the day, I probably talked for 8 to 12 hours. We were walking off the site, and I said, it's kind of like these woodland period farmers. So people that started producing food here 3,000 years ago were the first sustainable farmers. And he was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Well, the crops they grew were drought resistant. They didn't require fertilizer. You didn't have to plow fields. They come back on their own every year. They were like the original sustainable farmers." And it was that conversation and that idea that really started the garden project that I have to grow these plants again from an environmental justice standpoint, from a nutrient standpoint. It was that one conversation with him that kind of then led to the start of this garden and all these ideas that have kind of transformed into classes that I teach now or
Are the
conversations.
foods you
with
grow
students.
tasty at all?
Well, so I like the greens from the plants. So the project has been so small to this point, we haven't had a really harvest that we've been able to use to eat. We've had to use them as seed stock.
Right.
But we're getting to the point now where I have former students, and hopefully I'm going to teach a class in. So we're hopefully going to start one of these gardens at the Arboretum. And I'll teach a class next fall where students will, as part of the class, harvest, grow, and process and try to cook these foods. And so we just haven't had the harvest yet. Everything we've grown, we've had to use the seeds to replant. And so we're starting to. But yes, I have students who are making things like granola bars out of them. And amaranth is the big one. But amaranth grows on 6 continents, and it's in every kind bar you've ever eaten if you've had a kind bar. So a lot of people have eaten it and just don't know they've eaten it. So, and there's some other ones too. But yeah, so yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
That was an extended conversation. We might have even overshot time. Yeah, we did like.
I don't know what time it is.
Yeah, we did like an hour. We didn't overshoot time. We were right on time.
Okay.
Yeah, which is good.
There's supposed to be an hour.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is good. Yes.
All right.
So we hope you enjoyed yourself.
I thank y'all for having me.
Is there anything you wanted to plug before you go? Nah. You sure?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Also, I checked just to be sure. Heart disease is the biggest killer in North
I think
Okay,
so.
cool.
Yeah, I think it surpassed diabetes a couple years ago.
per CDC.
What's that? Yeah, it is. And again, if you think about, and again, to me, it's all very interesting. But yeah, the food. If you look back at some of the foods, and if you kind of like red meat, right? Red meat's what leads to a lot of what leads to heart disease, right? Yeah, I mean, you have the government with this, it got beef, it's for dinner. Like you have, the government pushing. I had this conversation the other day. We're the only species that drinks milk after they're weaned. Milk's not necessary. Milk's full of calories and sugar. But you have the government. I saw a commercial on TV last night. Got milk, right? So a lot of the products were pushed. You wouldn't have any idea that they're bad for you because our government is telling us. The government subsidizes. You guys are all too young to remember when the Cattlemen's Association sued Oprah Winfrey years ago. Oprah Winfrey made a statement on her show about red meat and about the harms of red meat. So she was sued by the Cattlemen's Association. So ground beef prices tanked. And so the government started to subsidize. That's where the whole Got Beef campaign, beef is what's for dinner, came from. So you have the government who's telling you to eat all this stuff, right? Cheese is another one. And the whole history of cheese and the relationship between skim milk and the cheese industry is fascinating. If you ever have time to like Google it or take the class in the spring, we talk about it. So when they started taking the fat out of milk to make skim milk, because people were concerned about the fat in milk, the government had to store all this milk fat. They were literally paying to store it in caves out west. They couldn't do anything with it. So they started making cheese with it. So see, when I was a kid, like, you had blocks of cheese at the grocery store. That was it. There were no like prepackaged, pre-shredded string cheese. So the cheese industry was really born out of the skim milk industry. And so now they talk about, cheese stuffed cheese pizzas and triple cheese this, and it's not always been the case. But the government had this excess of cheese, fat from milk. They had to do something with it. They turned it into cheese and then convince us that we need cheese. So cheese is high in fat, saturated fats. Milk is high in saturated fat. Red meat's high in saturated fat. Saturated fat leads to heart disease. So, but again, I think you have people who, and again, I'm not saying this is not a negative statement. Your government tells you to do something, and you're like, oh, it must be good. Like they're telling me to eat red meat. I'd probably should eat some more red meat. Then you see the correlations between this diet, these diseases, and then back to this idea of who's taking care of you. The same people that are taking care of you are encouraging you to eat food that might be causing the problems that they're fixing. And that's a scary kind of story to think about, right? And when students, we read some of this literature and it's like, wait a second. I'm not saying anything, but I'm saying it's there. I mean, so you see this kind of diet being encouraged. We know those foods aren't necessarily the best foods. And so, sugar and diabetes and all that stuff, it's...
Do you think back to the food pyramid that I grew up with when I was a kid, and then
it's
I
garbage
found out
now,
later
right? Yeah.
that apparently the food or sugar lobby had a large influence before that was even printed on the final result of that.
I'm sure. Well, you mentioned the sugar thing a little while ago.
Yeah.
And this is not. I'm not making this up. This is all. Under that, the whole thing about the sugar, the percentage. Again, go look on anything you look at the grocery store. Percentage of salt, percentage of carbohydrates, sugar, nothing. So people had lobbied to have that information put there so kids would know, parents would know, right? And the government basically said no, because the sugar lobby and the sugar producers in Minnesota went and said, you can't do this. You're going to put us out of business if people know. But that gets into a whole interesting conversation about these foods in the 90s.
A bottle of Coke is like 300% your daily limit or something.
Oh, but again, most people don't know how much sugar they're supposed to get.
Right.
And so if you tell people 2 teaspoons.
Usually it has daily value
Yeah,
percentages on that as well. Yeah, but not for sugar.
Not for
and
sugar.
Also, you could say that with teaspoons, but sugar's always in grams. Like
Right.
the FDA proposed having it switched to.
Because no one's going to sit there and do the math, right?
No.
But so one of the stories now, I read a lot of this stuff to my wife, who's a little bit younger than me. And so the big thing that always comes back to me are Lunchables, right? So it's this brilliant marketing scheme. Lunchables were let kids have lunch. Like it's their time, let them have lunch. Some of the meals they made had like 6,000 calories, like 30 teaspoons of sugar. And I asked my students, like, have you ever had that? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, how
do you eat 6,000? Wow.
How would you?
because all the stuff they have to put in the food to give it shelf life. Like meat's not supposed to sit on a shelf for 6 months. It's just not. Meat's supposed to spoil in a couple days. So how can they keep meat on the shelf for 6 months? You have to pump it full of chemicals. You have to pump it full of stuff to make it last. And so it's in that stuff that you get those calories and that,
But it's one portion.
Yeah, it was.
How do they go through that entire portion?
It was like Lunchable Extremes. My wife. So one of the stories I told was about pizza, right? And so the whole marketing story was, they brought moms in and they were like, your kids would like pizza, and they're like, well, it's too hard. They have to build these pizzas, and the moms hated it. And they brought a bunch of kids in, and the kids loved it. And so they marketed these Lunchable pizza things. But again, the calories, everything, it was just terrible. But they basically convinced people. The idea of Lunchables almost went broke at one point. And the guy that invented it took the idea to Philip Morris. And Philip Morris was the one that funded Lunchables, the cigarette company. So, who do you take your bad idea to? The cigarette lobby, because they don't, So, but it is like you start to see all these different. I'm sure you guys have all seen those kind of like bubble maps of, the 5 or 6 companies that own everything, right? Like the Conagras, it's everything. What's that?
Monsanto.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, they're selling you the cure and the disease, selling it all to you. But again, when the response to Lunchables, the company came out and said, well, we also sell Triscuits. So if you want a healthy snack, we'll sell you Triscuits. If you want a less healthy snack, we'll sell you Lunchables. And when you get sick, we'll sell you the vaccination at the hospital. So it is. It's interesting. And so, I know people get kind of funny about the idea of injustice and the injustice in the food system. But there are things there that are real, whether people believe it or not or want to. But I always try to approach it. I find it's easier with students to approach it through the environment. Most people are pretty comfortable talking about like environmental injustice. We live in that world. You guys grew up in that world. When I was a kid, the environment, that was like a mid-90s, where everybody was really concerned about the environment.
About milk, though, do you think it is just bad for you? Because I come from a culture where there's like thousands of years of milk use, not just, there's a milk use. I think the Rig Veda, which is like 3,000 years old as a script, references milk use as, people just grew cattle with them. Everybody had their own cattle. They don't eat the cattle because
don't kill cows, right?
Yeah.
So you've read like Marvin Harris and The Sacred Cow.
Yeah,
right. So it's the secondary products that are most important.
Yeah, and so
you don't kill the cow because.
I mean, I still have a family who grow cows, but they don't kill it.
Yeah.
They don't eat the cow, but they get the milk from it every day. They go out and manually get the milk from them. But do you? I don't know. It seems to have served at least my people for thousands of years. Especially since they don't eat meat usually.
The protein then you have to get.
Yeah, the protein you get from largely the milk.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I don't have a problem with milk. I don't. That's not something there's some interesting again the fact that we're the only species that drinks milk after being weaned. And then some of those kind of like interesting correlations between who's lactose intolerant today, where they come from, the regions they come from. No, I don't have a problem. My kids drink milk. I don't have but I think some of those, what's in milk, and then the whole milk and cheese thing to me is fascinating. When I started reading that stuff, I was like, holy crap! Like that's we're storing milk fat in caves. Like the government paying like thousands of dollars a day to store milk fat in caves, and then had to turn it into cheese. So. No, I don't have a problem with milk, but it's one of those things that always comes up because, again, when you can see a linkage between like products and disease and then, campaigns from the government saying to do it, then I'm not a conspiracy theory guy at all. I don't take that all the wrong way. But it makes you kind of like think like, oh, well, if, maybe we shouldn't be eating as much red meat. Maybe we shouldn't, But again, today with us, it's portion size. I heard a story I was listening to a story on NPR the other day about, until, before the like 1950s, people in most parts of the world use meat as a seasoning. So they would season stews, they would season, but today, everybody wants a 16-ounce ribeye steak for dinner. And so it's a difference in, portion size. And again, I think, when you see these trends, when you look at kind of global trends, they say the one thing that increases in everyone's life when they start to make more money is their meat consumption. Mm-hmm. And that now with global incomes on the rise, which won't change over the next 20, 30 years, that our demand for meat is only going to go up. And then that gets into the environmental impacts of raising large herds, the land you need to graze.
Actually, at least in terms of fast food here, it seems meat is cheaper to get than vegetarian options. But
I know for certain that.
I would imagine. Yeah, for sure.
The obesity rate's supposed to be lower among wealthier people in the States, I believe. But
right. That makes sense though.
Right.
So I was just talking about global trends in terms of where you're going to see economic develop.
Yeah.
In underdeveloped parts of the world now, that as they start to make more money, they demand more meat.
Yeah.
No, the reason I think you see people at higher income brackets with less obesity.
No, and that is true because in India, I keep referencing back to India, but in India, meat eating largely, even though millions of people eat meat, like 600, 700 million people eat meat, they only eat meat one day a week. They have either Sunday or Saturday cut off meat eating. Every other day they eat vegetarian food. So now that's increasing. Right now they're eating meat every other meal instead of one week a day.
In China, it's the same way, they say.
One day a week.
Yeah. And so this is like a trend you can see that people make more money, they eat more meat. And so, but again,
My friends who used to eat one meal a week, literally meat, now eat like 7 meals a week of meat. Right? They've
Because it's
shifted
more
from the. Well, yes, and there's also this. Even if they could afford it, they still had some religious sentiment about it. Now that's going away too. So there are religious days where you can't eat meat. There are religious days where you can. They'd rather eat it on the days you can and then you can't. Now people are becoming far less religious, that as well. But sure, there's also
exactly right. That's another whole interesting kind of tie into that story as well.
Because religion and food, at least in my country, are really intertwined, right? So
the whole Fish on Friday thing for Christians is all about
Catholics.
the fish industry and in
Wait,
Europe.
really?
Yeah. Was it Brian Fagan? There's a great book called Fish on Friday. It's all about.
That was.
I know I was raised Catholic, so
I'm wondering, did that?
He's a
fish
Catholic.
thing-
Are you? Yeah, no, I was raised Catholic. I was
raised
baptized,
Catholic,
confirmed, all that. I was.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, nice.
So,
Wait, was the fish thing not come before that, or did that industry develop out of it?
yeah, out of it.
Okay.
So, back to the point you made a minute ago about
Wealthy.
well, the way, right. So you've all heard like the whole pink slime thing. That's not a new concept, what pink slime is. So if you have more money, you can buy better cuts of food. And so instead of buying ground round, you buy ground chuck, right? So you get less fat. And so, you always hear that. I'll always have a student every semester that tells me they can't be poor, they're fat. There's not a correlation between the two, right? So if it's cheaper to buy bad food, you buy bad food. So if you go to the store and look at how ground beef is made, how you buy ground beef, right? You buy ground round, which is like 50-50. It's cheap. You buy ground chuck, it's 90-10. So 10% fat, 90% lean. It's like $7 a pound. So if you only have $4 or $5 and need a pound of beef,